Section 1. Pre-dawn over WWII. February 15, 1944. WWII airstrip, New Guinea. 3:47 a.m. The jungle was already awake. Somewhere beyond the darkness, insects screamed in the swamps like broken machinery, and heavy tropical air clung to everything's skin, uniforms, even the canvas walls of the tents. The night smelled of mud, engine oil, sweat, and rotting vegetation. Every surface felt damp. Every breath tasted thick. Inside a mosquito net stretched over a narrow army cot, Second Lieutenant William J. Smith snapped awake as a flashlight beam struck his face. "Rise and shine, Lieutenant. Briefing in 30. The non-com's voice disappeared into the darkness before Smith could answer. For a moment, he just lay there, staring upward into the dim shape of the tent roof. Sweat cooled across his neck. Somewhere nearby, another bomber crew was already moving, boots crunching over coral dirt, men coughing, metal canteens rattling softly in the dark. Smith rubbed his eyes hard. Another mission. Another long flight north. Another chance not to come back. He shoved the mosquito net aside and swung his feet onto the damp wooden planks beneath the cot. Mosquitoes immediately attacked the exposed skin around his ankles. He slapped one dead against his calf and cursed under his breath. 5 days earlier, WWII itself barely deserved to be called a base. It was more scar than airfield mud carved out of jungle by bulldozers and desperation. But it put them closer to the enemy. Closer to Kavieng. And today, Kavieng was waiting. Smith pulled on his sweat-stained flight suit and stepped outside into the blackness. The sky above New Guinea held no moon tonight, only stars, thousands of them, sharp and cold overhead, while the earth below remained steaming and alive. Rows of Mitchell bombers crouched along the airstrip like sleeping predators. Ground crews moved around them carrying lanterns shaded with red cloth. Mechanics checked engines. Armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition into waist guns. Bomb handlers rolled carts beneath the bellies of aircraft where 500-pound bombs waited in neat rows. You could feel the tension without hearing a word. Every man on that field understood what Kavieng meant. The Japanese fortress on the northern tip of New Ireland had become one of the most heavily defended strongholds in the Southwest Pacific. Its harbor swarmed with shipping. Fighters packed its airfields. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the approaches like steel thorns. And the Japanese knew the Americans were coming. Smith headed toward the mess tent, boots sinking slightly into damp earth. The canvas structure glowed faintly with yellow lantern light. Inside, exhausted airmen sat shoulder to shoulder at rough wooden tables, silently eating before dawn. The cook slapped pancakes onto tin trays. Smith took his plate and sat beside his bombardier, Lieutenant Frank Delaney, who looked half asleep already. "Nervous?" Delaney muttered. Smith shrugged. "You haven't stopped shaking since midnight." That got a tired grin. Smith cut into the pancakes and hid a pocket of dry batter powder hidden inside the dough. The white dust spilled into the syrup. For a second, his mind drifted home. Kentucky. Cold mornings, biscuits drowning in gravy, bacon crackling in a cast iron pan, coffee that didn't taste like burnt mud. Then reality returned fast. An ant floated across the surface of his cup. Smith skimmed it away automatically. Nobody complained anymore. Ants got into everything in New Guinea: coffee, sugar, socks, wounds. Men stopped noticing after a while, or maybe they just stopped caring. At the far end of the tent, someone lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Another crewman quietly wrote something on a folded piece of paper, probably a letter home, maybe his last. Nobody said that part aloud. Outside, engines coughed to life one by one. The deep radial roar of Wright cyclone engines rolled across WWII like distant thunder. Briefing began 20 minutes later. The aircrew crowded into a long canvas tent where maps hung beneath dim lights. Cigarette smoke curled beneath the ceiling. Sweat-soaked collars before dawn had even broken. An intelligence officer stood beside a large map of the Bismarck Archipelago. A red circle surrounded Kavieng. "Gentlemen," he began, "today's target is shipping and harbor infrastructure in Kavieng Township." Nobody moved. "Enemy resistance is expected to be severe." That got a few quiet laughs. Severe, that was Army language for hell. The officer continued pointing at the map with a wooden stick. Kavieng remains one of the primary Japanese logistical hubs supporting operations throughout New Britain and New Guinea. Harbor facilities are active. Aircraft assembly areas remain operational. Recon photographs indicate fighter concentration has increased significantly in the last 72 hours. Smith stared at the target photographs pinned beside the map. Docks, fuel dumps, warehouses, rows of aircraft. Every image was covered with grease pencil markings from bombardiers planning attack runs. Then came the part everyone dreaded. Enemy fighter estimates. Intelligence believes approximately 100 Japanese aircraft may be operating within interception range. A low murmur spread through the tent. 100. The briefing officer raised his voice. Primary opposition expected from Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima Kai 43 Oscars. Smith exchanged a glance with Delaney. That many fighters against medium bombers this deep over enemy territory? The math alone felt ugly. The officer continued anyway. Escort coverage will be limited. Now the room went completely silent. Limited. Another dangerous word. The 5th Air Force had learned brutal lessons across the Pacific. B-25 Mitchells were fast and heavily armed for medium bombers, but without strong fighter cover they were vulnerable during bomb runs. Japanese pilots knew it too. Especially near Kavieng. Questions? Nobody asked any. What was there to ask? How many of us are dying today? The briefing ended shortly after dawn began bleeding faint gray light into the eastern horizon. Outside, the airfield had transformed into organized chaos. Propellers spun, trucks bounced across the coral runway, men shouted over engine noise, the smell of aviation gasoline burned in the humid air. Smith walked toward his aircraft. The B-25 Mitchell waited on the edge of the strip, olive drab paint streaked with mud and exhaust stains. Its shark-like nose art looked faded now beneath months of combat grind. Ground crewmen were finishing fuel checks beneath the wings. The bomber's name was Miss Kentucky Belle. Smith placed a hand briefly against the aluminum fuselage. Cold metal. Thin metal. That was the terrifying truth every airman knew but rarely spoke aloud. At 20,000 feet, surrounded by cannon shells and machine gun fire, your entire world depended on aluminum barely thicker than a cooking pot. A crew chief approached carrying a clipboard. "She's ready, Lieutenant." Smith nodded. "Any problems?" The crew chief hesitated. "Starboard engine was running rough yesterday. We adjusted the carburetor." "Adjusted? Not fix." There was a difference. Smith looked at the engine nacelle for a long moment. Out here, aircraft stayed alive through miracles, spare parts scavenged from wrecks, and mechanics who somehow kept broken bombers flying beyond reason. "You trust it?" Smith asked quietly. The crew chief wiped sweat from his forehead. "I trust my boys." That wasn't exactly the same answer. The rest of the crew arrived moments later. Delaney the bombardier. Sergeant Joe Rizzo in the top turret. Corporal Eddie Kane at the waist gun. Staff Sergeant Miller in the tail. Young faces, exhausted eyes. Some barely old enough to shave every day. Smith climbed into the cockpit while dawn slowly revealed the jungle beyond the runway. Mist hung over the trees like smoke rising from hidden fires. Inside the cockpit, everything smelled familiar: oil, canvas, metal, electrical wiring. At least wartime home. He adjusted his headset while co-pilots across the airfield ran engine checks. One after another, Mitchell bombers taxied into position. 24 B-25s total. The Sunsetters. A full strike package heading straight into one of the most dangerous targets in the Pacific. Smith looked toward the northern horizon. Somewhere beyond those clouds lay Kavieng. Japanese fighters. Flak batteries. Burning ships. And perhaps something worse waiting for them in the skies ahead. Then the control tower fired a green flare. Tata. And one by one, the Mitchells thundered down the muddy runway toward the coming daylight. Section 2, into the Bismarck sky. The first Mitchell lifted off just after sunrise. Its twin Wright Cyclone engines roared against the jungle's silence as the bomber clawed into the humid morning air, wheels folding slowly beneath the fuselage. One after another, the B-25s followed, rising from WWII in pairs through clouds of dust and exhaust smoke. Inside Miss Kentucky Belle, Lieutenant William Smitty Smith kept one hand tight on the throttle while the bomber climbed northward over New Guinea's endless green wilderness. Below them, the jungle stretched like an ocean. No roads. No towns. Just mountains, rivers, swamps, and darkness beneath the trees. The Owen Stanley Mountains soon appeared ahead, jagged black ridges piercing through layers of mist. Even veteran pilots hated crossing them. Weather changed in minutes. Downdrafts could slam a bomber into a mountainside before the crew even saw the peak. Wrecked aircraft still lay hidden somewhere below those clouds, swallowed by jungle after disappearing without a trace. Smith adjusted the control yoke carefully as turbulence shook the bomber. "Altitude?" he asked. His co-pilot checked the gauges. 8,000 and climbing. The Mitchell vibrated constantly now, engines hammering like giant fists against the airframe. Every rivet seemed alive beneath the strain. Behind the cockpit, the crew settled into the long rhythm of combat flight. Gunners checked ammunition belts again. Bombardier Frank Delaney spread navigation charts across his lap. Radio operators monitored static-filled frequencies for emergency traffic. Nobody relaxed. Not this deep into enemy territory. The B-25 Mitchell was one of the most versatile aircraft of the war, fast, rugged, capable of low-level strafing or medium-altitude bombing. Crews respected it because it could absorb punishment and still fly. Some Mitchells returned with entire sections shredded away by cannon fire. Others didn't return at all. Smith glanced left toward another bomber flying close formation through the clouds. Sunlight flashed briefly off its cockpit glass. He could make out the silhouette of its pilot for only a second before mist swallowed the aircraft again. 24 bombers. Hundreds of men. All depending on formation, discipline, and luck. Especially luck. As the squadron crossed the mountains and headed out over the Solomon Sea, the sky finally opened. Blue water spread endlessly below them. The ocean looked calm from altitude, beautiful, even, but every airman understood how deceptive the Pacific could be. Somewhere beneath those waters rested ships, submarines, and aircraft from both sides, entire crews entombed without graves. Smith checked fuel consumption. Long-range missions to Kavieng pushed aircraft limits hard. There would be no room for navigational mistakes, damaged fuel tanks, or extended dogfights. Not with the distance involved. The bomber formation gradually tightened as they approached open enemy territory. Mitchells moved into staggered combat positions, each aircraft protecting the others with overlapping machine gun coverage. From a distance, the formation looked almost graceful. Inside the cockpits, it was exhausting work. Pilots constantly corrected position by inches to avoid collision while maintaining tight spacing. Too far apart and enemy fighters could isolate bombers individually. Too close and turbulence from prop wash risked disaster. Sweat rolled down Smith's neck despite the cooler altitude air. Hours passed slowly. Engines droned endlessly. Crewmen spoke little now. Combat missions always carried strange stretches of silence before violence erupted. Men sat alone with their thoughts while the aircraft pushed deeper toward danger. Corporal Eddie Kane stared through his waist gun window at the empty sky. He was only 19. Back home in Ohio, he had worked at a gas station before the war. Now he sat inside a flying aluminum tube carrying machine guns and high explosives across the Pacific Ocean toward Japanese anti-aircraft fire. He pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket. A girl smiling beside a fence. He looked at it for only a moment before sliding it away again. Nobody wanted to think too long about home before combat. It hurt too much. Up front, Delaney suddenly leaned forward over his charts. Approaching checkpoint Charlie. Smith nodded. That meant they were nearing New Ireland. Enemy territory now. The mood inside the bomber changed immediately. Eyes scanned the horizon harder. Gunners tightened helmet straps. Headsets crackled with formation chatter. Every man knew Japanese reconnaissance aircraft sometimes spotted incoming raids long before arrival. If enemy radar or coast watchers had detected them, fighters could already be climbing to intercept. Then came the first warning. A voice burst through the radio static. Bandits possible, 11 o'clock high. Every head snapped upward. Smith scanned the clouds. Nothing. Only sunlight glaring off endless white cloud banks. Seconds crawled past. Then Sergeant Rizzo shouted from the top turret. Aircraft, multiple contacts. Tiny black specks appeared far ahead. High altitude. Closing fast. The bomber formation tightened instantly. Machine guns rotated upward. Inside the Mitchells, safety catches clicked off one by one. Smith felt adrenaline flood through his chest. There they were. At first the approaching fighters looked motionless against the sky. Then suddenly they were larger, faster, distinct shapes now. Japanese Zeros. At least 20 of them. Maybe more behind the clouds. The fighters circled high above the American bombers like sharks scenting blood. Nobody fired yet. The Japanese pilots were positioning carefully, searching for weak spots information. Smith could almost imagine them studying the bombers through their gun sights. Choosing targets. Steady, Smith muttered. The first attack came without warning. 3 Zeros rolled downward out of the sun in a screaming dive. Fighters diving, 2 a block. Machine guns exploded across the sky. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit like burning orange needles. The attacking Zeros opened fire at nearly the same instant. Smith heard impacts hammer the bomber's fuselage. Flare, flare, flare. The Mitchell shook violently. More tracers ripped across the wings. 1 Zero flashed past so close Smith saw the pilot's goggles for a split second before the fighter vanished beneath them. Then the sky erupted completely. Japanese fighters slashed through the bomber formation from every direction, attacking in coordinated waves. Zeros climbed, rolled, and dove with terrifying speed while American gunners fired desperately to keep them away. The calm Pacific morning vanished inside seconds. Now it was noise. Violence. Chaos. Sergeant Rizzo's twin .50 calibers thundered overhead, shell casings pouring across the bomber floor. Waste gunners fired through open side windows into streaking shadows crossing the sky at hundreds of miles per hour. A Mitchell ahead suddenly burst into smoke. Its left engine exploded in flames. "My God," Delaney whispered. The crippled bomber rolled sideways, losing altitude fast while tracers ripped through it from pursuing fighters. Parachutes. 2 of them blossomed beneath the falling aircraft. Then the bomber disappeared into clouds below. Nobody saw it hit the ocean. Smith jerked the controls hard as another Zero attacked from behind. Bullets punched through the tail section. Sergeant Miller shouted over intercom static. "They're all over us." The Japanese pilots were good, very good. Years of combat experience showed in every attack run. They avoided concentrated gunfire, exploited blind spots, and attacked damaged aircraft mercilessly. Another Mitchell exploded off the right flank. Not a gradual fire. An explosion. 1 second the aircraft existed. The next second it became fragments tumbling through open sky. Smith felt his stomach tighten. Men he'd eaten breakfast with less than 5 hours earlier were simply gone. And the fighters kept coming. A Zero dived head-on toward Miss Kentucky Belle. Straight at the cockpit. Smith saw sunlight flashing across its wings. Saw the red Hinamaru insignia. Saw the pilot holding steady. Too steady. Head-on. Machine guns hammered from both aircraft simultaneously. Glass shattered inside the Mitchell cockpit. Smith ducked instinctively as rounds tore through the nose compartment. The Zero flashed overhead so close the bomber rocked in its wake. Then came a scream through intercom static. Delaney's hit. Smith looked right. The bombardier had collapsed sideways against the nose compartment bulkhead, blood spreading across his flight jacket. For one horrifying second, Smith thought he was dead. Then Delaney moved weakly. Still alive. Belle. And ahead of them, beyond smoke trails and burning sky, the northern coastline of New Ireland finally emerged through the clouds. Kavieng. The target. The real battle hadn't even started yet. Section 3, the fortress at Kavieng. The coastline of New Ireland rose out of the haze like something waiting. Dark jungle-covered mountains stretched along the island beneath towering thunderclouds, while white surf crashed valiantly against coral reefs below. Beyond the coastline, hidden among palm trees and military installations, lay Kavieng, the Japanese Empire's northern fortress in the Bismarck archipelago. And from 30 miles out, the Americans could already see smoke rising. Someone ahead of them was burning. Inside Miss Kentucky Belle, the intercom crackled with overlapping voices and static. "Bandits high right. Bomber going down. Stay in formation." Smith gripped the controls tightly while glancing toward Delaney slumped in the nose compartment. Blood stained the bombardier's sleeve and chest harness, but he was conscious, pressing one shaking hand against the wound. "You still with me?" Smith shouted. Delaney forced a weak nod. "Just a scratch." It clearly wasn't, but nobody had time for medics now. Another wave of Japanese fighters descended out of the clouds. Zeros attacked in coordinated pairs, one forcing bombers to maneuver while the second lined up deadly firing angles. The sky around the Mitchell formation became a spinning maze of tracers, smoke trails, and twisting aircraft. Sergeant Rizzo fired upward from the top turret until the barrels glowed faintly. "I got one smoking." A Zero spiraled downward trailing black smoke, but another immediately replaced it. The Japanese defense around Kavieng was massive. Smith counted anti-aircraft bursts appearing ahead even before the bombers reached the harbor. Black flak clouds blossomed high over the target area like deadly flowers. Too many. Way too many. Kavieng had become one of Japan's most heavily fortified strongholds outside Rabaul. After devastating Allied advances across the Pacific, Japanese commanders understood how critical the base remained. Supply convoys passed through its harbor constantly. Aircraft assembly plants operated day and night. Fuel depots, repair yards, ammunition dumps all hidden beneath jungle camouflage and protected by overlapping anti-aircraft batteries. The Americans had hit Kavieng before. The Japanese kept rebuilding it. Now the Sunsetters were flying directly into the heart of that defense network. The formation commander's voice crackled through the radio. "Bomb run in 3 minutes. Hold formation." 3 minutes. Every crewman aboard the Mitchells understood what that meant. No evasive action during bomb release. No sudden turns. They would have to fly straight and level directly over the target while Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft gunners concentrated everything they had against them. The most dangerous minutes of the mission were beginning. Smith wiped sweat from his eyes. Ahead, Kavieng Harbor finally came fully into view. And it was enormous. Ships crowded the anchorage below cargo vessels, destroyers, barges, transports. Sunlight reflected off the water between them while dock cranes towered above warehouses lining the shore. Smoke already drifted upward from earlier strikes against the harbor, but Japanese activity remained intense. Trucks moved along roads. Anti-aircraft batteries flashed constantly from hidden positions around the town. The place looked alive. Very alive. Too alive for comfort. "Jesus Christ," Kane muttered from the waist position. You could almost feel the enemy waiting below. Then the first heavy flak burst detonated directly ahead of the formation. A violent black explosion ripped through the sky. Another followed instantly. Then another. Within seconds, the air around the bombers filled with bursting anti-aircraft shells. Black clouds surrounded the Mitchells at varying altitudes, each explosion sending jagged steel fragments tearing outward at lethal speed. The Japanese gunners had found their range. The bomber shook hard as turbulence from nearby explosions battered the wings. Play! A fragment punched through the fuselage behind the cockpit. Another shell burst beneath the left wing so close Smith felt the aircraft physically lift sideways. "Hold her steady," Delaney shouted painfully from the nose. Easy for him to say. The Mitchells pushed forward into the flak corridor anyway. No turning back now. Smith could see the target area clearly through brakes and smoke fuel storage tanks near the docks. Massive cylindrical containers packed tightly together beside warehouses and loading cranes. If the bombs hit correctly, the explosions could cripple harbor operations for weeks. That was the plan. Assuming they survived long enough to drop them. Japanese fighters continued attacking even through their own anti-aircraft fire. Zeros slashed across the formation while flak bursts erupted around both sides indiscriminately. The sky had become a killing zone. A B-25 off Smith's left side suddenly lurched upward violently. Its entire nose compartment vanished in a flash of orange fire. For one impossible second, the bomber continued flying. Then it folded apart. The front half separated completely while the rear fuselage spun downward trailing debris and flames. Smith stared in horror. There had been men inside the aircraft less than a heartbeat ago. Now pieces of aluminum and burning fuel spiraled into the harbor below. "Bomb doors open," Delaney called. Hydraulic motors whined beneath the bomber. The Mitchell became instantly more sluggish as bomb bay doors spread open into the rushing airstream. Another flak burst exploded directly in front of them. The cockpit vanished inside black smoke and shrapnel. Smith instinctively ducked while fragments hammered the windshield. Cracks spread across one glass panel. Warning lights flashed briefly. The right engine coughed. For one terrifying moment, Smith thought they'd lost it. Then the engine stabilized again with a deep angry roar. The formation pressed onward. Steady. Level. Straight into hell. Down below, Japanese ships opened fire with deck-mounted anti-aircraft guns. Streams of tracers climbed upward from the harbor itself, converging toward the bombers. The entire city seemed to be shooting at them. Delaney crawled painfully toward the Norden bomb site despite his wound. Blood smeared across the compartment floor beneath him. Almost there. Smith kept the bomber aligned while trying not to think about how exposed they were. Every second over target increased the odds of dying. Flak bursts surrounded them so densely now the sky resembled a thunderstorm made of explosions. Then came the worst sound a pilot could hear. Fire! Left engine fire! Smith looked out instantly. Orange flame streamed backward from the port engine cowling. Fuel or oil? Either could kill them. Can you feather it? The co-pilot shouted. Not yet. If they shut down the engine too early while fully loaded with bombs, they might lose altitude directly over the target area, and down there waited enemy fighters, ocean, and Japanese guns. Smith held the Mitchell steady despite the flames. Bombs away in 10 seconds, Delaney yelled. 9. Another 0 attacked from below. Machine guns thundered from the waist positions. 7. The fighter flashed past trailing smoke but still firing. 6. Flak exploded beneath the tail. 5. The bomber jolted violently. 4. Warning alarms screamed across the cockpit. 3. The harbor filled the bombardier's sight completely now. 2. 1. Bombs away! The Mitchell jumped upwards suddenly as thousands of pounds of explosives dropped free. Smith banked hard left instantly. Too late. A massive flak burst detonated directly beside the bomber. The explosion punched through the aircraft like a giant hammer. Metal tore. Lights die. The cockpit filled with smoke. And somewhere behind him, a crewman screamed. Section 4, fire over the harbor. The explosion hit Miss Kentucky Belle like a train collision. Smith's head slammed against the side window as the Mitchell rolled violently left. Warning lights flashed red across the cockpit before several instruments simply went dark altogether. Smoke burst through the fuselage seams. The aircraft dropped hundreds of feet almost instantly. For a horrifying second, the bomber stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like it was dying. Hello. The co-pilot's voice barely cut through the chaos. Smith fought the controls with both hands. The yoke felt heavy now. But something in the aircraft had changed. Behind the cockpit, somebody was still screaming. Not shouting. Screaming. Then came Sergeant Miller's voice through intercom static. Canes hit. Waist sections hit bad. Another violent shudder ripped through the bomber. Smith forced the Mitchell into a shallow climbing turn away from the harbor while Japanese anti-aircraft fire chased them across the sky. Tracers whipped past the cockpit windows in red arcs. Below them, Kavieng erupted. The bomb strike had landed. Huge explosions rolled across the waterfront as fuel tanks detonated one after another. Fireballs climbed hundreds of feet into the air while black smoke spread over the harbor. Ships near the docks vanished behind flames and debris. Secondary explosions burst through warehouse roofs. Even through combat panic, the crew could see they had hit something important. But the Japanese defenses were far from finished. Fighters coming back around, Rizzo shouted. Zeros swept in again through the smoke columns. The Mitchell formation had completely fragmented now. Bombers scattered across the sky, some trailing smoke, others descending toward the ocean. Japanese fighters isolated damaged aircraft like wolves separating wounded prey from a herd. Smith scanned desperately for surviving Mitchells. He counted maybe 10 still airborne nearby. Out of 24. God help the rest. The left engine fire worsened suddenly. Flames streamed backward across the wing. Temperatures redlining, the co-pilot warned. Smith cursed under his breath. If the wing fuel tank ignited, the entire aircraft could explode. Feather the engine. The co-pilot grabbed the controls for the damaged propeller system. Seconds later, the left prop slowed awkwardly before locking into feather position to reduce drag. The bomber immediately lurched sideways. Now they were flying on one engine. Over enemy territory. Hundreds of miles from friendly airfields. And Japanese fighters still circled around them. "Can we hold altitude?" Smith asked. The co-pilot checked quickly. "Vole." That was enough for now. Smith keyed the intercom. "Miller, status back there." Static crackled. Then came Miller's strained reply. "Cane's down, lotta blood." "Alive?" A pause. "Yeah, I think so." Smith swallowed hard. Inside the waist compartment, Corporal Eddie Kane lay crumpled beside the machine gun mount. Flak fragments had torn through the fuselage, shredding metal and flesh alike. One jagged piece of steel had ripped into his thigh while another struck his shoulder. Blood covered the floor beneath him. Miller pressed bandages against the wounds while trying to keep firing at attacking fighters. There were no medics aboard B-25s. Only whatever the crew could do themselves. Another Zero flashed across the bomber's nose, firing cannon rounds. The Mitchell shook again. Glass fragments sprayed through the cockpit. Smith banked sharply right to spoil the fighter's aim. Too sharply. With one engine dead, the bomber nearly stalled. Altitude dropped fast. The ocean suddenly looked very close beneath them. Easy. Smith corrected hard while sweat poured down his face. The Mitchell stabilized just above stall speed. Barely flying now. That was the terrible balancing act of damaged bombers in the Pacific. Too slow and the aircraft fell from the sky. Too fast and overstressed engines could fail completely. And still the Japanese kept attacking. Through gaps in smoke, Smith spotted another B-25 ahead attempting escape at low altitude. A pair of Zeros dove behind it, firing continuously. Tracer rounds stitched across the bomber's wing roots. Then the Mitchell exploded. A bright orange flash over blue ocean. Debris scattered across the water below. No parachutes. The sky around Kavieng had become a graveyard. More fighters. Smith looked upward. 3 Zeros approached from high altitude, diving directly toward Miss Kentucky Belle. The bomber crew opened fire immediately. Twin .50 calibers hammered from the dorsal turret while Miller's tail guns spat tracers upward. The Japanese fighters split apart at the last second, attacking from different angles. One passed beneath the Mitchell, firing upward into the belly. Another raked the tail section. The third came head-on. Smith saw cannon flashes blinking from the Zero's wings. Then impact hammered the cockpit. The windshield starred with fresh cracks. Oil splattered across one instrument panel. The co-pilot jerked backwards suddenly. Smith's stomach dropped. For one terrible moment he thought the man was dead. But the co-pilot grabbed his arm tightly. "I'm okay," he gasped. A bullet had torn through his sleeve, grazing flesh but missing bone. But if luck even existed anymore. The attacking Zero overshot the bomber and climbed away, smoking from defensive gunfire. Sergeant Rizzo shouted triumphantly. "I hit him, he's leaking fuel." The fighter rolled sideways, trailing vapor before vanishing toward the clouds. One less enemy. Dozens more remained. Ahead, the surviving Mitchells struggled to regroup beyond the harbor. Smoke columns from burning fuel depots climbed thousands of feet into the air behind them, visible for miles. The attack had hurt Kavieng badly. But the price was becoming unbearable. Smith counted another bomber limping westward with half its rudder shot away. One engine streamed smoke while crewmen leaned from waist windows, firing at pursuing fighters. Then it disappeared inside clouds. Nobody knew if it would emerge again. The radio exploded with desperate calls. "Mayday, going down. Need fighter support. 2 engines out." Static swallowed the transmission. Somewhere below, another bomber hit the sea. Smith forced himself to focus. One thing at a time. Get away from Kavieng. Stay airborne. Keep the crew alive. The Mitchell trembled continuously now from damage and engine imbalance. Control cables responded sluggishly. Hydraulic pressure fluctuated dangerously. And fuel. Fuel was becoming a problem. The damaged engine fire had burned longer than Smith realized. The co-pilot checked gauges again. "We're leaking." "How bad?" He hesitated. "That enough." Silence filled the cockpit for a moment except for engine noise and distant gunfire. They both understood what that meant. Even if the bomber escaped Japanese fighters, fuel loss might prevent reaching WWII. There were no emergency airfields nearby. Only jungle, ocean, or enemy islands. Smith looked back toward the burning horizon behind them. Kavieng still boiled with smoke and explosions beneath scattered anti-aircraft bursts. Japanese fighters continued circling the battlefield like vultures over wreckage. And somewhere out there, damaged American bombers were still trying to make it home. Then Sergeant Rizzo's voice suddenly cut through the intercom again. "Contact low 6 o'clock." Smith twisted in his seat. A lone Zero emerged through smoke behind them. But this pilot wasn't attacking yet. He stayed just outside machine gun range. Watching. Following. Like he knew the Mitchell was wounded. The Japanese fighter slowly climbed closer. Patient. Careful. Waiting for the right moment to kill them. And Miss Kentucky Belle was running out of sky, fuel, and time. Section 5, the hunter behind them. The Zeros stayed there. 6 o'clock low. Close enough to see clearly now. Its silver-gray fuselage shimmered against the Pacific sunlight while the red Hinamaru roundels burned bright on its wings. Unlike the earlier attacks, this Japanese pilot wasn't rushing. He wasn't diving recklessly through machine gun fire or making wild strafing runs. He was stalking them. Inside Miss Kentucky Belle, every man aboard could feel it. Sergeant Miller kept his twin-tail guns trained on the fighter while sweat rolled into his eyes. "He's hanging back." Smith understood why immediately. The Japanese pilot had recognized the crippled bomber. One engine dead. Fuel leaking. Formation broken. Easy prey. The Zero drifted slightly closer. Still outside effective range. Still waiting. Smith glanced toward the fuel gauges again. Needles sinking lower. Too fast. The bomber continued westward at reduced speed while the remaining Mitchells scattered across the horizon in loose fragments of what had once been a coordinated strike force. Cloud cover ahead offered the only hope. If they could disappear into weather, maybe. The Zero attacked. Without warning, the fighter surged upward and opened fire from directly behind. Tracer rounds ripped past the tail. Miller fired instantly, both .50 calibers roaring together. The Mitchell shook under the concussion. The Zero banked sharply sideways, avoiding most of the return fire, then climbed again for another pass. "He's good," Miller muttered. "Very good." The Japanese pilot was using textbook energy tactics: hit fast, climb away, never stay exposed. Experienced, disciplined. Dudley. Smith shoved the bomber into a shallow turn, trying to spoil the fighter's firing angle without losing too much altitude. The controls felt worse now. Heavy. The late flak damage must have severed or weakened part of the hydraulic system. The bomber responded like an injured animal. The Zero came again. This time from above. Cannon shells slammed into the upper fuselage with explosive cracks. Metal fragments sprayed through the radio compartment. Sparks burst from damaged wiring. Rizzo screamed over intercom. Hydraulics hit. Warning alarms lit the cockpit again. Smith fought to keep the aircraft level while smoke drifted through the cabin behind him. The Japanese pilot climbed away smoothly after the attack. Still patient. Still hunting. The crew began firing before the Zero even turned for another pass now, spraying tracers into empty sky from pure nerves. Nobody wanted to wait for the next attack. Then came a new problem. Fuel pressure dropping. The remaining engine sputtered once. Just once. But everyone heard it. A silence followed that felt colder than fear itself. Because now the possibility hung openly inside the aircraft. Not maybe. Not eventually. So, if the second engine failed, the Mitchell would not stay airborne long enough to ditch safely. Smith pushed the throttles carefully, trying to stabilize fuel flow. The engine steadied again. For now. Outside the cockpit windows, clouds thickened ahead over the Solomon Sea. Huge tropical formations towered thousands of feet into the sky like mountains made of white smoke. If they reached those clouds, visibility would collapse. The Zero pilot knew it too, which meant he would attack hard before they got there. Sure enough, the fighter rolled into another dive. This one straight toward the cockpit. Head on. Machine guns thundered. The Zero fired simultaneously. Bullets smashed through the bomber's nose compartment. One round shattered part of the windshield. Another punched through the instrument panel. The fighter flashed overhead so close Smith saw the pilot's face for a split second. Goggles, scarf, oxygen mask. Calm eyes. Focused eyes. Then the Zero vanished past them. Rizzo screamed triumphantly. Hit him! Hit him! Smith twisted around. The Japanese fighter trailed thin smoke now from its engine cowling. Not enough to stop it, but enough to wound it. The Hunter had been hit too. For the first time, the Zero kept greater distance while circling behind them again. Maybe reassessing. Maybe angry. Maybe both. Inside the bomber, Kane groaned weakly from the waist section. Miller kept pressure on the wounds while trying to reload ammunition belts. Stay with me, kid, he muttered. Kane's face looked ghostly pale beneath smeared blood and sweat. 19 years old. Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. Bleeding inside a shattered bomber while a Japanese fighter stalked them through the sky. War reduced entire lives into moments like this. The clouds ahead loomed larger now. Dark. Massive. Violent weather churned inside them. Lightning flickered faintly deep within the storm columns. Smith made his decision. We're going in. The co-pilot looked at him sharply. That storm will tear us apart. So will the Zero. No argument after that. The Mitchell descended toward the cloud bank while turbulence increased rapidly. Rain streaks became visible ahead like gray curtains hanging from the sky. Behind them, the Zero accelerated. The Japanese pilot understood immediately what the Americans intended. And he wasn't letting them disappear easily. The fighter attacked again from below and behind. Tracer rounds ripped across the bomber's underside. Then came a deafening metallic bang beneath the cockpit floor. The aircraft lurched violently. What was that? Rizzo answered first. Bomb bay's hit. Smith's blood froze. The bomb bay was empty now, but fuel lines and hydraulic systems still ran through that section of the aircraft. Smoke poured upward through the fuselage. Electrical sparks flashed briefly behind the cockpit. Then the bomber's landing gear warning light blinked on unexpectedly. Hydraulic failure worsening. The Mitchell dropped altitude fast as turbulence hammered the airframe. Rain engulfed them. Instantly visibility collapsed into gray chaos. The bomber entered the storm. And it felt like flying inside a waterfall. Rain smashed against the windshield so hard it sounded like gravel. Lightning flickered through the clouds around them while violent updrafts hurled the Mitchell sideways. The aircraft groaned under the strain. Behind them, the Zero disappeared into the storm too. Still pursuing. Still hunting. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Smith could barely see the bomber's own wingtip through the rain. The instruments spun nervously from turbulence. Altitude fluctuated wildly. The surviving engine sputtered again. Then lightning exploded nearby. A blinding white flash illuminated the cockpit for an instant so bright it erased all detail. And in that frozen flash, Smith saw something ahead. Another aircraft. Dead ahead. A Mitchell bomber emerging through the storm clouds directly in front of them. Collision course. Section 6, collision in the storm. Aircraft ahead. Smith slammed the control yoke sideways instinctively. The Mitchell rolled hard right inside the storm clouds while alarms screamed across the cockpit. Rain hammered the windshield. Visibility vanished completely except for one terrifying glimpse of another B-25 materializing out of the gray directly ahead. Too close. Much too close. The other bomber flashed past beneath them with only yards to spare. Smith caught fragments of detail in the lightning glare, a shredded tail section, one propeller frozen motionless, smoke trailing from the fuselage. Then it disappeared back into the storm. Jesus Christ, the co-pilot whispered. The turbulence worsened immediately after the near collision. The cloud system over the Solomon Sea had become a monster. Updrafts slammed Miss Kentucky Belle upward, then violent downdrafts dropped the bomber so suddenly everyone aboard felt weightless for a sickening moment. Loose ammunition boxes crashed across the fuselage floor. Rain leaked through fresh bullet holes and flak tears in the aircraft's skin. The Mitchell sounded like it was coming apart. Metal creaked continuously around them. Lightning flashed again. For an instant, Smith saw the bomber's damaged left wing glowing pale blue with static electricity. St. Elmo's fire danced along the propeller tips. The sight felt ghostly, unnatural, almost beautiful. Then darkness swallowed them again. Altitude, the co-pilot shouted. Smith checked the instruments. Dropping. Fast. The storm was pushing them downward toward the ocean. He pulled back hard on the controls while the remaining engine roared at near maximum power. Come on, hold together. The bomber climbed reluctantly. Every movement now felt sluggish, wounded, exhausted, much like the crew itself. Behind the cockpit, Sergeant Miller struggled to secure Kane against the fuselage wall while turbulence hurled both men sideways. Kane's condition was worsening. A blood loss. His lips had turned pale blue. You stay awake, understand? Miller barked. Kane barely nodded. The 19-year-old's eyes drifted half shut again. Another violent jolt slammed through the bomber. The radio compartment suddenly exploded in sparks. Fire! Electrical fire! Smoke poured through the center fuselage. Rizzo grabbed an extinguisher while the bomber bucked wildly through the storm. He sprayed foam blindly toward flickering flames near damaged wiring bundles. For several seconds, nobody could tell if the fire was spreading. Then the sparks finally died. Smoke remained thick. The smell of burned insulation filled the aircraft. And somewhere behind them, hidden by rain and darkness, the Japanese fighter was still there. The realization came suddenly when tracer rounds ripped through the clouds beside the bomber. The Zero had followed them into the storm. Son of a bitch! The fighter flashed briefly through the rain off the left side, almost impossible to track against the lightning and cloud cover. Cannon fire stitched across the Mitchell's wing route. The Japanese pilot had become even more dangerous inside the storm. Now attacks came from nearly invisible angles. Short bursts. Sudden flashes. Then disappearance. Like a predator moving through fog. Miller fired wildly into the clouds behind them while Rizzo searched the darkness overhead through the turret sights. You see him? No. Lightning erupted again. For a split second, the Zero appeared directly above them. Then it vanished. Another attack came immediately afterward. Bullets shattered through the tail section. Miller cursed loudly as fragments tore into the compartment around him. He's trying to finish us. Because he knew they were close now. Close to dying. Close to falling. Close to losing control completely. The storm intensified further. Rain became a solid wall outside the cockpit. Thunder cracked so violently it shook the bomber like nearby explosions. Instruments flickered from electrical interference. Then the artificial horizon failed. One of the most critical instruments in bad weather. But Smith's stomach tightened instantly. Flying blind inside a tropical storm without reliable horizon reference killed pilots fast. Spatial disorientation could flip an aircraft upside down before the crew even realized it. And somewhere below waited the Pacific Ocean. Invisible. Cold. Endless. The bomber lurched again as turbulence hammered the wings. Fuel pressure dropping more. Smith looked down. The remaining engine's gauges trembled dangerously. Fuel leak worsening. Every minute in the air increased the chance of total engine failure. The Zero attacked again. This time tracers ripped directly through the cockpit canopy. Glass exploded inward. The co-pilot cried out as fragments cut across his face. Smith felt wind blast suddenly through the shattered section of canopy while rain sprayed across the instrument panel. Then he saw it. The Zero overshot slightly during the attack. Too close. Too aggressive. Rizzo seized the chance instantly. The top turret opened fire point blank. Twin .50 calibers hammered upward. Tracer rounds slammed into the fighter's underside. The Zero burst into flame. Bright orange fire exploded from its engine compartment. For one incredible moment, The Japanese fighter stayed airborne, climbing through rain and lightning with flames streaming behind it like a comet. Then the wing separated. The aircraft rolled violently sideways and vanished into the clouds below. Nobody spoke. The sudden silence after so much combat felt unreal. Only engine noise and storm turbulence remained. Finally, Miller's exhausted voice crackled over intercom. "Did we get him?" Rizzo stared into the storm where the fighter disappeared. No cheering followed. No celebration. The crew was too exhausted, too wounded, too aware of their own situation. Because killing the fighter hadn't solved the real problem. The bomber was still barely flying. And now the storm itself became the enemy. A massive downdraft struck without warning. The Mitchell dropped like a stone. Altitude unwound terrifyingly fast. "Pull up." Smith hauled back with everything he had. The controls barely responded. The bomber plunged deeper through cloud layers while alarms screamed across the cockpit. 2,000 feet. 1,500. Rain obscured everything outside. Then suddenly the bomber burst beneath the cloud deck. And the ocean appeared directly below them. Dark waves. Whitecaps. Shockingly close. Maybe 300 feet beneath the aircraft. Climb. The remaining engine roared furiously while Smith fought the controls with desperate strength. Slowly, painfully slowly, the Mitchell leveled out just above the crashing sea. For several seconds, nobody breathed. The bomber skimmed across the Pacific at dangerously low altitude while rain hammered the fuselage. Then another sound emerged. Different from turbulence. Different from engine noise. A rhythmic metallic grinding. Smith heard it immediately. So did the co-pilot. Hydraulics. Something inside the aircraft was failing completely now. Then the control yoke suddenly jerked violently in Smith's hands. The bomber rolled left by itself. He corrected hard. Nothing happened. The Mitchell kept rolling. Control response was disappearing. And ahead through the rain, rising from the ocean like dark teeth, came the jagged coastline of another island. Section 7, the island below. The island appeared through sheets of rain like a nightmare surfacing from the sea. Black cliffs. Dense jungle. Jagged mountains disappearing into low storm clouds. Smith stared at it through the cracked windshield while wrestling the failing controls of Miss Kentucky Belle. "Where the hell are we?" The co-pilot checked the soaked navigation chart spread across his knees. His face tightened immediately. Enemy territory. Not what anyone wanted to hear. The bomber continued rolling left despite Smith's corrections. Hydraulic pressure had nearly vanished now. The controls responded sluggishly, almost disconnected from the aircraft itself. Another metallic grinding noise echoed beneath the cockpit floor. Then came a loud snap somewhere inside the fuselage. The bomber lurched hard sideways. Smith fought it with brute force. The control cables themselves might be fraying now. Or worse. Behind the cockpit, Sergeant Miller braced himself against the tail section as the Mitchell bucked violently through rain and turbulence. "You got us under control up there?" Smith didn't answer. Because he honestly didn't know. The remaining engine strained at near full power, but the bomber was losing altitude again. Every turn felt dangerous. Every vibration threatened structural collapse. And below them lay a Japanese-held island crawling with enemy troops. The storm clouds thinned briefly, revealing more coastline ahead. Then everyone saw it at once. An airfield. Long coral runways cut beside the shoreline. Rows of revetments. Camouflaged buildings. Aircraft parked beneath palm camouflage nets. Japanese markings clearly visible even through the rain. The crew fell silent. A Japanese base. And they were flying directly over it. Almost immediately, tracers climbed upward from the ground. Anti-aircraft guns. The enemy had spotted them. Flat. Black bursts erupted around the crippled Mitchell as Japanese gunners opened fire from below. Compared to Kavieng, the barrage was later, but against a bomber already barely controllable, it felt lethal enough. Smith shoved the Mitchell into a shallow, evasive turn. The aircraft responded late. Too late. A shell burst off the right wing. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage again. Inside the bomber, lights flickered, then died completely. Only gray daylight filtered through the storm now. No internal power? The intercom crackled once and went silent. Electrical systems were failing too. Smith could no longer hear the crew behind him except for distant shouting. The bomber descended lower over the coastline. Too low. Japanese soldiers below scattered from roads in gun positions, pointing upward as the damaged American bomber roared overhead, trailing smoke and leaking fuel. Smith could actually see faces now. Tiny figures running. Machine gun positions swinging toward them. Then tracers ripped upward from the airfield itself. One stream crossed directly through the bomber's path. Bullets punched through the nose compartment again. Delaney cried out weakly from below the cockpit. Smith glanced downward. The bombardier had lost consciousness. Blood covered his flight suit completely now. Not much time left. The Mitchell crossed beyond the airfield and back out over open water. But the island still stretched ahead endlessly. Too large to bypass at their current altitude. And then came the moment every pilot feared most. The engine coughed. Was. Twice. Then again. Louder this time. Smith stared at the gauges. Fuel pressure collapsing. The leak had finally reached critical levels. The co-pilot looked at him quietly. No words needed. They both understood. The engine was dying. The bomber descended lower still, skimming over rough ocean waves while rain lashed the fuselage. If the engine quit entirely, they would have only seconds to prepare for ditching. And ditching a B-25 in heavy seas often killed crews instantly. Medium bombers were not designed for water landings. Aircraft frequently flipped, broke apart, or sank within minutes. Especially damaged ones. Smith scanned the island desperately. No safe landing zones. Only jungle and enemy positions. The engine sputtered violently again. Smoke burst briefly from the exhausts. Then power returned weakly. For now. The crew behind the cockpit began throwing unnecessary equipment overboard to lighten the aircraft. Ammo boxes. Damaged gear. Anything heavy. Miller crawled forward through the smoke-filled fuselage until he reached the cockpit hatch. We ain't making WWII, are we? Smith kept his eyes ahead. No. The honesty hit harder than shouting would have. For several seconds, only engine noise filled the cockpit. Then Miller nodded once. What's the plan? Smith looked out at the storm-dark ocean below. There really wasn't one. Not a good one. But pilots were expected to choose anyway. If they ditched near shore, Japanese patrols might capture any survivors. If they tried staying airborne longer, the bomber could break apart uncontrollably over open sea. If they attempted landing in jungle terrain. No, that would kill everyone. The engine sputtered harder. The propeller speed fluctuated visibly now. Time was ending. Smith made the decision. Prepare to ditch. Nobody argued. No panic followed either. Just silence. A heavy kind of silence. Because after hours of terror and violence, the crew had finally reached the edge of possibility. Now survival depended on luck and water. Miller crawled back through the fuselage shouting orders. Me west's on. Secure loose gear. Raise positions. The men moved quickly despite exhaustion and wounds. Inflatable life vests were tightened. Emergency rafts checked. Escape hatches loosened in case the fuselage twisted during impact. Kane drifted in and out of consciousness while Miller strapped him securely against the bulkhead. Stay awake, kid. Outside, the storm slowly weakened as they emerged from the heaviest rain bands. Gray sunlight spread across the ocean again. The sea looked rough. Too rough. White caps rolled across long swells beneath them. Smith lowered altitude carefully. The Mitchell trembled violently now from structural damage and failing systems. Then the engine gave one final cough. A horrible grinding sound followed. And the propeller stopped turning. Silence hit the cockpit like a physical force. No engine noise. Only rushing wind. The bomber immediately began sinking toward the ocean. We lost her. Smith grabbed the controls tighter. The Mitchell was now a glider. A heavy, damaged, wounded glider over enemy-controlled waters. Altitude unwound rapidly. 500 feet. 400. 300. The ocean rushed upward beneath them. Smith lined up with the swells as best he could. Training took over now. Nose slightly high. Wings level. Touch parallel to the waves. Fay. Behind him, crewmen braced for impact. Some whispered prayers. Some stared silently ahead. Some thought of home. 200 feet. 100. The Mitchell descended toward the dark Pacific. Then suddenly, a shape appeared ahead on the water. A ship. Gray hull. Low silhouette. Moving through the swells beneath the storm clouds. For one impossible moment, Smith couldn't process what he was seeing. Then the realization hit. Japanese destroyer. Directly in their path.